The rain fell like shattered promises across the bones of Colony 7, each droplet carrying traces of ash and regret as it hammered against the twisted skeletal remains of what humanity had called progress. Captain Elena Reeves moved through the devastation with practiced silence, her boots finding purchase on rubble that had once been the central marketplace. The storm had intensified over the past 3 hours, transforming from mere weather into something almost vindictive, and through the grey curtain she could barely make out the transit hub's collapsed framework, its support beams jutting skyward like the ribs of some enormous beast left to rot. She'd been alone for 47 days since her evac shuttle was shot down, and in that time she'd learned to navigate the ruins by memory and necessity, scavenging what survival demanded. But today something was different to sound beneath the rain's percussion, high-pitched and desperate, coming from the collapsed entertainment district. Elena approached cautiously, her hand resting on the plasma cutter at her hip, but instead of scavengers or wounded survivors, she found something that made her freeze. 3 predator cubs huddled beneath what remained of a transit shelter, their bodies pressed together in a futile attempt at warmth, their iridescent scales dulled by rain and starvation. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, their 6 eyes barely glowing with the bioluminescence that should have been bright enough to illuminate the shelter. When the largest one turned its elongated skull toward her, Elena felt her military conditioning scream at her to draw the plasma cutter, to eliminate the threat before these cubs grew into the 12-foot apex predators that had torn through human defensive lines and left entire settlements empty. But the sound the cub made wasn't a challenge, it was the wordless plea that all young things made when cold and scared and abandoned. Elena had spent 4 years killing the adult versions of these creatures, had watched them eviscerate her friends with claws designed to penetrate body armor, yet standing in the rain watching 3 starving infants tremble, she found those narratives dissolving, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that suffering looked the same regardless of species. The decision crystallized in the space between heartbeats. Elena knelt slowly and unzipped her thermal jacket despite the rain's immediate invasion, holding it open like an invitation, like an offer of shelter that transcended enemy designations and military doctrine. The cubs didn't move initially, their survival instincts warning against the scent of human hell, against the species that had orbital bombed their breeding colonies. But cold was immediate and ancestral memory was abstract, and when the smallest cub took one tentative step forward on legs that wobbled with malnutrition, the others followed in a desperate scramble. They piled into her jacket's interior with surprising weight, their bodies radiating desperate need, their underdeveloped claws catching on the thermal lining as they burrowed against her ribs. Elena wrapped her arms around the jacket's exterior, holding them there, feeling their hearts beating frantic rhythms, and understood she'd just crossed a line that military law would classify as treason. The journey back to her shelter became an exercise in paranoia and protection, the cubs shifting and making small questioning sounds inside her jacket, their combined body heat making her realize how cold she'd been for weeks. She navigated through the residential quarter, past homes where nameplates still identified families, the Okonkwo's, the Yamadas, the Sullivans, each name a small memorial to ordinary lives shredded by forces larger than individual choice. Her shelter occupied the lower levels of the colony's primary medical facility, accessible through maintenance tunnels she'd cleared and trapped. Inside, emergency lighting cast everything in amber and shadow, illuminating her survival supplies, water purification, military rations, the assault rifle she maintained but hadn't fired since the last evacuation shuttle departed without her. The cubs tumbled out when she unzipped the jacket, their legs uncertain on smooth flooring, their eyes adjusting with visible pupil dilation that reminded her of intelligence operating through neurological architecture humanity had barely begun to understand. They explored with universal curiosity, investigating corners, pawing at equipment, making questioning sounds at their reflections. The largest cub approached her food storage with obvious interest, and Elena found herself dividing her dinner into smaller portions, watching the cubs attack the food with desperate efficiency. She'd been surviving on reduced rations anyway, but feeding infant predators with military provisions felt like crossing into territory she couldn't map. The cubs ate until their stomachs distended, then collapsed near her thermal generator, their purring creating white noise that filled the silence Elena had been living in for so long. Sleep came in fragments, and Elena woke to find the cubs arranged around her sleeping pad in a defensive perimeter. The smallest had pressed itself against her spine, and when Elena shifted, it made a tiny interrogative sound that bypassed her combat training entirely and struck something protective that responded before thought could interfere. Morning arrived in shades of grey, and Elena woke to find the largest cub attempting to hunt her boot with serious concentration. When it looked up with frustrated confusion, Elena felt laughter bubble up from some place she'd thought permanently closed. She spent the morning teaching them basic coordination, watching the cubs develop timing through play that nature had designed to become deadly serious. The afternoon brought a surveillance drone passing overhead, and Elena moved the cubs into the shelter's shielded interior while her equipment screamed warnings. Through her tactical display, she watched the drone linger hovering, scanning. Its AI processing thermal signatures according to algorithms that flagged anything displaying predator movement patterns for immediate elimination. The drone departed after nearly a minute, and Elena realized with crystalline clarity that keeping them was impossible, that eventually someone would come and see 3 predator cubs and remember only the war, only the casualties. But that night, when the smallest climbed into her lap and fell asleep, its bioluminescent patterns creating shifting constellations across her skin, Elena decided that impossible was tomorrow's problem. Days accumulated into weeks. The largest, which she designated 1, was bold and curious. It displayed problem-solving intelligence that unnerved her when it figured out how to open secure storage. 3 attached itself to Elena with devotion that transcended imprinting, seeking proximity as its own reward. She took them on expeditions, watching them learn through senses she could only partially comprehend. They saved her life during the 4th expedition when they suddenly froze and emitted a clicking alarm seconds before a building collapsed. She lay in rubble with 3 cubs pressed against her chest, everyone protecting everyone else, and understood they'd evolved into genuine partnership. The discovery happened accidentally during a search for supplies in the facility's deeper levels. When one triggered a concealed door mechanism, they tumbled into a chamber that didn't exist on any colony schematic. The laboratory was pristine and powered, its walls lined with stasis pods and data terminals. And when Elena accessed the main console, she found files that rewrote everything. The holographic displays showed genetic sequences merged across species boundaries, hybrid DNA structures, research notes in multiple languages, human and predator both, evidence of collaboration that military command had sworn didn't exist. The cubs weren't pure specimens. They were designed, engineered by joint scientific teams. The logs spoke of communication breakthroughs, of shared threats that made alliance necessary, of breeding programs meant to create bridge species. The cubs weren't just survivors. They were prototypes, living proof that the war had been preventing the peace both species needed. She understood with growing horror that they were classified, experimental, the kind of secret that organizations killed to protect. The facility's destruction hadn't been collateral damage. It had been systematic elimination of everyone who knew. Elena had survived only because she'd been presumed dead, and the cubs had survived only because the purge was incomplete. The patrol ships arrived 5 days later, giving Elena time to make decisions. The smart choice was obvious: secure the cubs, contact the patrol, return to military service. But Elena had stopped making smart choices when she opened her jacket to 3 starving cubs, and she understood that some things mattered more than career survival. These cubs trusted her, and she wouldn't deliver them into the same system that had tried to kill them once. She spent 12 hours preparing emergency protocols, downloading every file, rigging the facility to auto-purge evidence. When she loaded the cubs into a transport carrier, they went without protest, trusting her judgment. The crashed transport wasn't far, a civilian vessel from the war's final months. She spent the night bypassing safety locks and rerouting auxiliary power, coaxing dormant systems into one final activation, while the cubs explored, their bioluminescence painting the interior with moving light. The soldiers found her empty shelter at dawn. She watched through remote cameras as they swept the facility, confusion evident when they found nothing. The confrontation happened in the ship's cargo bay, 4 soldiers surrounding Elena while she stood between them and the carrier. The squad leader spoke reasonably about classified materials, and Elena heard in his voice the same justification she'd once used. She said no, and the word hung in recycled air like a declaration of independence. The soldiers shifted uncertainly, and Elena understood she was watching them make the same choice she'd faced: follow conditioning or follow conscience. The standoff broke when the smallest cub pushed out and pressed against Elena's legs, purring audibly, looking at the soldiers with eyes that held only curiosity. When it made its questioning chirp, one young soldier lowered his weapon and said quietly that he didn't sign up to shoot children, regardless of species. The squad leader's certainty fractured as his team's cohesion collapsed. They left with warnings, but they left, and Elena secured the door with hands that only shook after it was safe. The ship's engines coughed to life, and Elena strapped into the pilot's chair while the cubs settled in passenger seats, secured with restraints meant for human children. The takeoff was violent, and through the viewport, Elena watched Colony 7 fall away, the ruins and memories, the battlefields where humanity had tried to build permanence. The cubs made uncertain sounds as artificial gravity failed, and Elena activated stabilization systems, watching readouts that promised they'd make orbit before mechanical collapse. She thought about everything she'd lost: unit, career, species loyalty, and found she didn't miss them. Not with 3 predator cubs watching her with trust that made responsibility feel like privilege. The rain had stopped by the time they cleared atmosphere, and in orbital sunrise, Elena could see the whole world spread out like a promise or warning. The cubs unbuckled as weightlessness took effect, tumbling through the cabin with delighted confusion, and the smallest eventually floated to Elena's position. She unzipped her jacket without thinking, and it hurried in just like that first time in the rain, seeking warmth and belonging. Elena wrapped her arms around the outside, holding close this small life that trusted her absolutely, that had chosen her the same way she'd chosen it, not through logic, but through simple recognition that sometimes the only thing that mattered was the choice to shelter each other from the cold, to protect, not because it was smart or safe, but because protection was what living things did for each other when they decided that compassion was stronger than fear. That humanity's greatest strength had never been its weapons, but its willingness to use them as shields instead of swords. The navigation system plotted courses while Elena held one small predator and watched 2 others play in zero gravity, their sounds filling the cabin with music that resembled nothing like war and everything like the future both species deserved. If they were brave enough to build it together,